Us Dragon Ball fans are constantly going on and on about power scaling, but it's about time we scale something that Akira Toriyama himself would actually have cared about. That, of course, being a character's comedic level. The author of Dragon Ball himself loved a good gag, and outside of Dragon Ball, they're front and center in all of his works. But even within Dragon Ball, they're still plentiful. So which character stands at the peak of comedy? That's what I want to find out today. In preparation for this video, I've gone through the entire manga and counted every time each character was involved in a gag or joke. Since comedy is subjective, my score won't be dependent on how funny I personally think a gag is, just the attempt at a joke is enough. So with that, let's jump in. So to really discuss comedy in Dragon Ball, I feel like we need to start with some background. When Dragon Ball began back in 1984, it was unequivocally a gag manga. The primary focus of the story was exclusively to tell jokes, and that holds true for at least the first 3 arcs of the story. But starting in the second arc, the series sprinkled in a bit of tension and drama. After that, we would just keep slowly leaning more and more into the action and drama until the 22nd Tenkaichi Budokai, where I can confidently say the story was not a gag manga anymore. There was still the occasional joke, but the main focus of the story from that point onward was telling a compelling narrative. There's this idea that was being brought up during the release of the recent series Dragon Ball Daima, that its extra focus on comedy was more faithful to the original manga than the previous Dragon Ball Super series. This isn't really true, and I think this is a good time to bring up some of our low-tier characters. Can you guess how many jokes the very popular character Vegeta was involved in before the release of the Buu Saga? Well, the answer is 2. Similarly, Goku's previous main rival Piccolo was involved in a grand total of 3 jokes before the Buu Saga, and some other characters worth noting would be Gohan and Ten Shinhan at 6 each. So if the majority of our main cast pre-Buu Saga was almost never involved in comedic scenes, why do I remember there being so much comedy in the story? Well, after Toriyama transitioned away from the gag manga style, he would find a different outlet for comedy in the story, that being gag characters. Toriyama would employ characters like Chi-Chi, Mr. Satan, and Yajirobe, whose entire job was almost exclusively to throw gags into an otherwise serious story. This is especially apparent in the Demon King Piccolo arc, where if it wasn't for Yajirobe, the arc would have had 0 comedic moments. Now I've been including a little asterisk there. I keep saying pre-Buu Saga. That is of course because when approaching the last arc in the story, Akira Toriyama decided to pull a 180 and completely shift the direction of the story. Suddenly, comedy was back in the forefront. Now, I won't go as far as to call the Buu Saga a gag manga, but the resurgence of comedy was a pretty massive shift for the series. To really put into perspective, Vegeta, who was previously involved in like 2 jokes, jumps up to 14, and Piccolo goes from 3 to 10, while Gohan jumps from 6 all the way up to 29. It can't be understated just how dramatic of a shift the Buu Saga was. Now you might say, oh, so the comedy from Daima is faithful to the Buu Saga, right? Well, even that isn't really true. While the Buu Saga does massively shift back into comedy, it's still an action drama at heart. Its primary focus, for the most part, is still telling a compelling narrative. There's just a few more laughs along the way. In contrast to that, in Daima, it really feels like telling jokes was more important to Toriyama than the actual story. But that's as far as I want to get into Daima in this video. Now that we've got the timeline out of the way, let's talk about specific characters. Starting at the bottom of my rankings, there are a few characters who just don't have a ton of screen time, like Pan, who only shows up during the last chapter of the story, but has more gags in that one chapter than Vegeta had in the entire story before the Buu Saga. Or big names like Kid Buu or Vegito, who similarly just lacked screen time. Now generally, screen time is obviously going to be a factor. You won't be surprised to hear our main character Son Goku is at the top of this list, but screen time isn't everything. But if you want to give me a bit more screen time, you should consider subscribing, so you can get recommended my new videos as they come out. So getting into our top 10, I have the Ginyu Force as one entity here at 21 gags. The Ginyu Force adds much needed comedic levity to the Namek arc, as even without explicitly taking time to tell jokes, they're just funny to watch, with Goldo scurrying around, to Recoom's flamboyant fighting style, to Ginyu's body swapping shenanigans. They really break up the action before we dive into the very serious fight with Frieza. Following them is Yamcha at 24, which might surprise you, Since he's been around for so long, you probably expect the funny man Yamcha to be higher. But honestly, Yamcha was consistently the most serious member of the gang before Ten Shinhan showed up. Back in the first arc, Yamcha had his gag of fearing women, but that got resolved pretty early on, and most of his fights in the Tenkaichi Budokai are played straight, with minimal comedy. A lot of things we make fun of Yamcha for in the fandom simply weren't supposed to be jokes in the story itself, like when Yamcha has his leg broken, or when Yamcha dies, or when Yamcha gets impaled. None of these moments are actually supposed to be funny, they're all played straight in the series itself. So like I said, he's really only this high due to how long he's been around for, and following him is the title character of the Boo arc, at 27. Now Boo has his fair share of gags and jokes, but the main reason he's so high is simply due to how goofy he is. Even when he's contributing to serious scenes, he's just a funny guy to watch. Similarly to the Ginyu Force, Boo can be out here decimating the population of a city, and somehow it's a comedy scene. Toriyama was truly a comedic genius. At the same score as Boo is Yajirobe. I already talked a bit about this earlier, but Yajirobe is the first of several characters we will discuss that basically only exist to be comic relief. He's essentially the only reason the King Piccolo or Saiyan sagas have any comedy in them at all. But after that, he really falls off and stops appearing in the story. Surpassing him is Gohan at 29. The main reason for this is the Boo saga essentially became a gag manga for a few chapters early on during Gohan's school life, where he really racked up points, while also gaining a few during his shenanigans in the Kai realm. It really is wild though that he went from 6 to 29 in the last arc. That brings us to the top 5. This is where we see a significant jump in gag points, and start really getting into the big names of the list. Starting with Master Roshi at 50. The thing about Roshi is he was literally like the second most important member of the cast for a long time. If we're only talking about Dragon Ball before Z, then Master Roshi would be number 2, only below Goku. For a long time, Master Roshi was Toriyama's go-to when it came to comedy. He loves pervy jokes, and Roshi is our resident pervert. But it's not just that. Roshi was the driving force that pushed the plot forward for several arcs, and a lot of that put him into tight situations that led to comedy. Like him thinking he might lose as he watches how strong Goku is, or how the tournament announcer heckles him for blowing up the moon. The Turtle Hermit was just a funny guy. Narrowly surpassing his master is Krillin at 53. You probably associate Krillin as the comic relief character of Dragon Ball, and that's somewhat accurate, but a big part of why he's so high up is just because he has more screen time than anyone else besides Goku. He's certainly funny early on, but he's always trailed behind the gag machines of Roshi and that one other person by a decent amount. It's not until Z that he slowly catches up, and when I say slowly, I mean it. Krillin isn't nearly as comedy-focused in Z as you think. In the 23rd tournament, his fight with Piccolo is played completely straight, and in the entire Saiyan saga, Krillin is involved in almost zero gags. He very gradually accumulates an extra 20 points to surpass Roshi over the entire course of Z. Now while Krillin is up here due to screen time, that can't be said for the next character. Mr. Satan somehow gained a staggering 57 points in his limited screen time. Mr. Satan is kinda like Yajirobe in the sense that he was inserted for comic relief in an otherwise serious story, but unlike Yajirobe, instead of fading into the background, Mr. Satan was introduced right before the Boo saga doubled down on comedy, so he essentially got upgraded to the main cast. We get a ton of stuff with him at the Budokai, and his entire bit with Fat Boo was actually some of the funniest stuff in the series. Due to that involvement, he ends up getting to be present during the final fight, providing comedy while also being the heart of the story. Mr. Satan really proves screen time isn't everything. Also, did you know Toriyama wanted to do a spin-off gag manga about the life of Mr. Satan and Boo after Dragon Ball? That eventually became Neko Majin Z, but I kinda wish he stuck to the original plan. Anyways, that brings us to the second place character below Goku, who as you probably already know, is Bulma at 68 gags. Bulma, just like Krillin, has been around since the very beginning. Now unlike Krillin, Bulma and Roshi were always neck and neck in terms of jokes in original Dragon Ball. Bulma's aggressive and petty personality was always a good comedic match for the rest of the cast. Now unlike Roshi who fell off, or Krillin, who just isn't super gag focused in Z, Bulma from start to finish is a gag character. If Bulma is on screen, it's probably for a gag. She's on Namek to be comic relief, and she shows up to the battle with the androids to be comic relief. Like everyone else, she she falls off a lot in the Buu saga, but by then, she already had a commanding lead. Speaking of a commanding lead though, the unsurprising actual top spot goes to Son Goku at 119 gags. Oh boy, here comes Goku at the top spot simply because he's the main character and has the most screen time. But you know what? That's not entirely true. Arc to arc, joke to joke, Goku is consistently one of the funniest characters. In nearly every arc, Goku outpaces everyone else in terms of gags, even in the arcs where he has comparatively less screen time. I mentioned how there's significantly less comedy in Dragon Ball Z, but even then, one of the only sources of comedy in Z is consistently Son Goku, whether that's from his banter with King Kai in the Saiyan saga, or his goofy fighting style against Frieza. In fact, nearly half of Goku's gag points come from Dragon Ball Z, despite its notable drop in comedy. Son Goku really does represent both the action and comedy of Dragon Ball perfectly. He's just a goofy little guy. So that's it for the gags of Dragon Ball. You know, originally, I was going to literally go over and explain every gag in the entire series, but shockingly, there's a lot of gags in Dragon Ball, and I realized what a silly idea that was. Anyways, a good gag can break up the intense action of everyday life, so I think you should consider taking the time for gags in yours. Anyways, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time.